Unit 1. Belonging to a group. Chapter 1. Marriage, Family, and the Home. Getting started. Listening for factual information. Page 5.
I'm going to give you an overview of the average age at which people get married in different countries around the world. Let's start in Africa. As you'll see in number 1, Egypt, men get married at 26 and women at 24. But in Niger, which is country number 2, while men get married at 24, women tend to get married much earlier, at 18, or even before. In South Africa, number 3, men get married at 29 and women at 27. In North and South America, there are differences too. In Argentina, which is country number 4, men get married at 27 and women at 23, as you see. But in Canada, they wait until much later. Men in Canada get married at 31 and women at 29. In the United States, the numbers are a little lower. Men get married at 28 and women at 26. Let's go on to talk about Asia now. In China, men get married at around 34 and women at 29. In Japan, the average age for a man to get married is 35, while for a woman, it's 27. Okay, and last but not least, let's talk about Europe. Country number 9 is France, where men get married at 32 and women at 30. And last of all, we have Spain. Men in Spain get married at 34 and women at 33. That's the oldest of all the countries we have seen.
Interview 1. Growing up in a large family. Listening for details. Page 8.
Hello, Ricky. Can you tell me about your family?
Yeah, well, I come from a pretty big family by most standards. I have 4 siblings, and I'm the second oldest. I'm in college now, so, I'm not living at home anymore, and I really miss everybody.
That's too bad. What do you miss about them?
I miss them for different reasons. Like, I'll be honest, it's nice to have home-cooked meals, for example. I don't get that anymore. And then I miss my brothers and sisters because we're very close. Sometimes we fight, but then we usually make up, and in general, I'd say that we get along well.
Do you spend a lot of time together?
Well, let's see. We don't spend all our time in each other's company, but I think there are some things that families should do together, like important celebrations. A few months ago, my cousin got married, and he had a big party, about 200 people. I got to see my whole extended family. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I only remotely remembered. Family rituals like that are great because they remind you of your roots. We took a lot of pictures of everyone dancing and hanging out and talked about it for a long time afterward. And other events are also important. New babies getting born, birthdays, holidays, even deaths.
What about spending time together on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's important too. For example, I think that it's good to have dinner as a family. When we were growing up, Mom always tried to make sure that we sat down and ate together several times a week, even though my parents both worked and everyone was really busy. But I remember looking forward to family dinners when I was younger. We'd always talk about what happened at school that day, and if we were tired or had some problem, we could tell each other what was going on. We laughed a lot as well. See, I think that families have certain functions.
Like?
Well, the first one is taking care of basic necessities, like shelter, food, clothing. Now that I'm on my own for the first time, I can see it's a big job. I share an apartment with a friend, but I had to learn to shop and cook and do laundry and take care of myself. I told you I missed my parents, right? The first time I washed my clothes, I wasn't sure exactly how much detergent to use. But in addition, families give you a kind of emotional support. Yeah, we used to be in touch every single day, but obviously that's difficult now. Recently, I got a C in one of my classes, and I didn't want to talk to my friends about it because I was embarrassed. If I'd been at home, I would have asked my parents what to do because I didn't think that was a fair grade, and I was kind of angry, but in the end, I had to handle it on my own.
You said there were 5 of you in your family. 5 children? Do you ever have any problems?
Yeah, of course. There's probably a lot of sibling rivalry among us. We all get jealous of each other sometimes. My sister's kind of bossy, and my brother and I, we are only 1 year apart. When we were growing up, he would always borrow my favorite clothes, and that would drive me crazy. We used to fight like mad, but now it's getting better. But you know what? You learn pretty much everything from your family. You even learn how to fight. And that's important because you also learn how to compromise and how to say sorry. And that prepares you for life outside the family.
Interview 2. Family Stories. Responding to questions with short answers. Page 9.
Can you tell me a favorite family story?
Well, one of my favorite stories has to do with Thanksgiving. We've always had problems cooking the turkey, and I guess it started when we were young. We were having a big dinner, and we were about to sit down at the table. It was a big party. There were about 15 of us, 'cause my aunt and uncle and all the cousins were there, and everyone was getting ready. And suddenly, my father realized that we left some of the plastic packaging inside the turkey. It had been cooking for about 4 hours, and he said, "If your mother finds out about this, she'll make me throw the whole thing out." So he distracted my mother, pulled out the plastic, and threw it in the garbage. And then he served the turkey as if nothing had happened. And my sister and I were giggling so much we could hardly eat. But we kept it secret and didn't tell my mother until years later. And by then, it was too late for her to get mad.
Oh, that's funny.
Oh, man. But it doesn't end there. Another year, we bought a fresh turkey because we thought it would be better to have a fresh one than a frozen one. But then, when we got it home, there was no room for it in the refrigerator. So we said, no problem. We'll put it outside overnight, and that's what we did. But then, you're never going to believe this, there was a big frost that night. It went down to about 20 degrees, and the next morning, the turkey was frozen solid. So there was no way we could have it for Thanksgiving. In the end, I think it took about 2 days to even thaw out.
You seem to have had bad luck with turkeys.
Yeah, it's hysterical. Every time someone mentions turkeys, we all start laughing.
Sheila, tell me about a family keepsake, some item that belongs to your family.
Well, one thing I always associate with my family is a statue, like a figure of a woman holding a bowl, about 6 inches tall. I think it used to belong to my dad, but after my parents divorced, my mom kept it.
What does she use it for?
Well, she keeps her earrings in it, plus other small things she doesn't want to lose, like receipts or safety pins. It's useful that way. You can always find whatever you want in that bowl.
Why does it remind you of your family?
Well, first of all, it's unique, and I think it's very beautiful.
Huh.
The second thing is that this statue has been in my house ever since I was a baby. See, recently, I was looking through an old family album, and I suddenly noticed that, hey, the statue was in all the photographs. So it provided me with a feeling of continuity.
Is it valuable?
No, it's worth absolutely nothing, except to us. I'd like to be able to have it in my house in the future, and then I'll pass it on to my children. It'll be like a family heirloom.
Tina, is there a family member you'd like to know more about?
Yeah, I have an uncle who I haven't seen since I was a child.
Why not?
Well, he was the black sheep of the family. He got married and divorced about 4 times, and then he went to live abroad. He works in tourism, and I think he travels a lot. But it's hard to talk about him with my family. I think there was some big disagreement at one point, and now they hardly ever talk.
Listening for stressed words. Page 10. 1.
I'm not living at home anymore, and I really miss everybody.
2.
Mom always tried to make sure that we sat down and ate together.
3,
We've always had problems cooking the turkey.
4,
I always wanted to play with the bowl.
5,
My uncle works in tourism, and I think he travels a lot.
Lecture. Beth Handman. Family lessons. Before the lecture. Main ideas and supporting details. Page 15. 1,
First, then, let's discuss rewards. A reward can be defined as a positive reinforcement for good behavior.
2,
Punishments are the second important way in which a child is socialized. All of us have probably been punished in our lives. For example, maybe our parents stopped us from going out with friends because we did something we were not supposed to do.
3,
Parents can set a good example by showing children the kind of behavior they expect. Let me give you a personal example. I know a boy called Peter who told me he liked to study because his mother studied with him.
4,
There's an old saying in English, don't do as I do as I tell you. If you say that to a child, it means that the child should not copy what you do, but instead just do what you are telling the child to do. But this advice doesn't work most of the time. Some studies have suggested that if you smoke yourself, it's probably ineffective to tell a child not to smoke.
5,
So understandably, parents are often worried about the negative lessons that children can learn, for example, from other children or from TV. TV can send children a lot of negative messages. In fact, it's been estimated that on average, 80% of programs contain violent behavior.
Lecture. Part 1. Rewards and punishments. Organizing your notes in columns. Page 17.
Hi, welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about how children learn social behaviors, especially how they learn lessons from the family, the most basic unit of our social structure. There's a lot of discussion these days about how families are changing and whether non-traditional families have a good or bad effect on children. But it's important to remember that the type of family a child comes from is not nearly as important as the kind of love and support that exists in the home. I'd like to focus on 3 of the ways that children acquire their behaviors: through rewards, punishments, and finally modeling. First then, let's discuss rewards. A reward can be defined as a positive reinforcement for good behavior. An example of a reward is when a parent says, if you eat your vegetables, you can have ice cream for dessert. Or a parent might say, finish your homework first, then you can watch TV. Most parents use rewards unconsciously because they want their children to behave well. For example, a parent might give a gift to a child because the child behaved well, or parents might give a child money for doing what the parents asked. The opposite of a reward is a punishment. Punishments are the second important way in which a child is socialized. All of us have probably been punished in our lives. For example, maybe our parents stopped us from going out with friends because we did something we were not supposed to do. Or maybe they wouldn't let us watch TV because we got a bad grade on a test. Both rewards and punishments are controversial. Many people think they are not effective or necessary, especially when used often. Let's take this situation. A young boy has been asked to take out the garbage. Listen to situation A. The parent says, if you take out the garbage for me, I'll give you a cookie. Some people argue that this reward is unnecessary because it's like a bribe. They argue that the child should be taught that it's his duty to help with the household chores. and that he should not get a special reward for doing something that's his responsibility. Situation B would go something like this. Justin, please take out the trash now. And Justin says, okay, Dad. Not surprisingly, punishment is extremely controversial, especially when the punishment is physical. Some of us grew up expecting to be spanked if we misbehaved. For example, our parents may have hit us on the hand if we talked back to them. But I don't agree that spanking can teach children anything. And sadly, some children are subject to really serious physical abuse. According to a study I just read, 1 in 22 children is a victim of physical abuse. Children who come from homes where violence is used to solve problems are much more likely to abuse their own children when they become adults and have their own families.
Lecture, Part 2. Modeling. Organizing your notes in columns. Page 19.
The third way that children are taught how to act is through modeling. Modeling means that they learn to behave by following an example. Modeling is probably the most powerful way that children learn social skills. Children look for role models in their life, meaning people who they admire and want to copy. Children's first role models are their parents. Parents can teach children by modeling appropriate behavior, as various researchers have noted. Parents can set a good example by showing children the kind of behavior they expect. Let me give you a personal example. I know a boy called Peter who told me he liked to study because his mother studied with him. This is an important lesson that he learned just by copying his mother's behavior. There's an old saying in English, don't do as I do as I tell you. If you say that to a child, it means that the child should not copy what you do, but instead just do what you are telling the child to do. But this advice doesn't work most of the time. Some studies have suggested that if you smoke yourself, it's probably ineffective to tell a child not to smoke. The child will most likely think, well, my mother smokes, so why shouldn't I? Modeling is the most important way that children learn. And of course, parents are not the only people teaching children. Other family members and friends are also models. Many people do not even realize the impact they can have on a child that they know. But children carefully watch other people around them and notice the way they behave. It's important to note here that it is common for babysitters, relatives, and child care centers to take care of children as well as parents. So children are exposed to many models of behavior. They learn from each other, from their teachers, and from society itself. So understandably, parents are often worried about the negative lessons that children can learn, for example, from other children or from TV. TV can send children a lot of negative messages. In fact, it's been estimated that on average, 80% of programs contain violent behavior. I'd like to conclude by reminding you again that the most important thing for children is to grow up in an environment where there are fair rules that are clearly established and followed consistently by everyone. If the child knows what the expectations are, he or she will find it much easier to acquire good behavior. And if the child is loved and exposed to strong, positive role models, the child will quickly begin to grow in a healthy way.
Unit 1. Belonging to a Group. Chapter 2. The Power of the Group. Getting started. Listening for specific information. Page 24.
Would you go to the wedding, Rebecca?
Of course I would. If it's your family, you're kind of expected to go along, aren't you?
I disagree. I wouldn't go. I'd say I had to work that weekend or make some excuse like that.
Okay, Jim. Would you go to the movie with your friends?
Yeah, sure. It might be good. Reviews aren't always right.
I'd go too. I agree. Sometimes the newspaper says that a movie's no good, but it turns out you like it. And even if it's bad, I'll have a good time with my friends anyway.
And the shoes. Rebecca, would you consider buying them?
Well, Maybe not buying them, but I might try them on. They might look good on me. And if everyone's wearing them, perhaps they're really comfortable or something.
No way. I don't care what my friends think. Fashion is a personal choice.
Okay, and next, would you go away with your parents?
Definitely not. I really don't want to spend the whole weekend with my parents' friends, especially if I have to study.
Me neither. My mom would probably put pressure on me to go. She'd tell me that I could do my work in the country, but I wouldn't want to spend a weekend with their friends either.
All right, last question. Would you accept the help of your mother's friend?
Well, no, I don't think so. I don't really want to get involved with my parents' friends.
I disagree. If I needed a job, I'd love to get some help.
Interview 1. Living with teenagers. Listening for main ideas. Page 27.
Henry, what is your opinion about group pressure?
Well, I'm the parent of 2 teenage boys. I know all about group pressure because of them.
Yes, they say that adolescence is the time when children begin to get most pressure from their peers. Do you think that's true?
What I've seen is that adolescence is the time when the pressure begins to shift from the family and the school to friends. I think it begins about 11, but comes into full bloom at about 13, 14.
What actually happens then?
Well, the first thing you see is that adolescents begin to make fashion statements. And certainly those ideas don't come from you. You can tell at a glance that they don't come from you. Like getting tattoos, piercing their ears, and, dyeing their hair. My younger son began to ask if he could dye his hair blue.
And what did you say?
We said when he was a little older, he could make that decision, with the hope that that fad would have passed out of style. We told him he should be an individual.
Where would you draw the line? I mean, presumably you'd let him wear whatever clothes he wants, but would you let him pierce his ears or dye his hair?
I think, in the end, I would. But not without a fight.
So, what other things happen?
Well, as the kids get older, you start to lose them because they're always talking on the phone or talking online or doing other things. Even when they're home, they're in their room most of the time talking on the phone. And not just talking on the phone, they might be talking to one person on the phone and 2 other people online. And the only thing you know for sure is they're not talking to you.
Do you think this is all normal behavior? And should you be trying to monitor it?
I think both. Of course, it's healthy for kids to follow their peers, but I also think that parents should monitor their kids' behavior. When it's a question of fashion, that's okay. Where you draw the line is when they're doing something dangerous or illegal. Drugs, smoking, drinking. And make no mistake, not all peer pressure is good. Parents always worry that their kids will get bullied by other kids who may be older or stronger. And kids sometimes join cliques, which exert a lot of pressure on them.
What kind of cliques?
For instance, you'll find that all the kids who like a particular kind of music will hang out together. They are real copycats, and they tend to listen to the same thing. Or like we were discussing fashion before, they'll all get their hair cut the same way or wear the same style. Up to a point, that's normal behavior, but what you worry about is that they won't use their own common sense, so you have to keep an eye on them.
Is there any advice you could give parents?
Well, one thing is to think back to your own experience as a teenager. I must say, I find myself repeating the same annoying language my father used with me. I have to try to remember not to do that. You have to trust them. You can't discuss every single decision they make.
So it's important to respect your kids' independence.
Yes, which is sometimes hard to do. It's hard to watch your kids doing things you don't want them to do. For example, my kids are into video games, and I can't find any value whatsoever in these games. But you don't have to like everything your kids do, as long as it's not dangerous or illegal. Sometimes it's important to just leave them alone.
Interview 2. Expressions about groups. Listening for specific information. Page 28.
Hi, Grace. Nice to talk to you. You are originally from China, right?
Yes, I am, but I've been living in the U.S. for over 20 years now. I immigrated as a graduate student, and I've lived here ever since.
You just heard Henry talk about the peer pressure his sons face and the way he deals with it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I respect Henry for the way he treats his sons. It sounds like he gives them a lot of independence and the chance to stand on their own 2 feet. But we have a different approach in my culture. I would never let my children dye their hair, and I think children should do their homework before they start talking to their friends online.
Can you tell me a bit more?
It's difficult to explain, but in Chinese culture, at least in my community, there is much more emphasis on doing what your family thinks is right. We don't usually just let our children do whatever they want. We worry what other people will think.
That's interesting.
Yes, and what I'm particularly interested in is how people express this idea when they speak, because I'm a linguist.
So tell me about your experience.
Well, in English, there are lots of expressions about being yourself, like people say, think of number 1. When I first got to the U.S., I asked myself, who are they talking about? Who is number 1? And then I realized it's me.
That's funny. What else?
What I really like are all the expressions with animals, you know, and they emphasize the dangers of being in groups. For example, I learned the proverb, birds of a feather flock together. That means that you tend to hang out with people who are like you.
Yes, that's a common expression.
And that's not so bad. But then they sometimes say that people act like a herd of sheep. That expression deals with conformity. That means they don't think for themselves. That's like saying you shouldn't follow other people's behavior.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and there's also the expression about doing things in droves. Like in this example I learned, they flocked to the concert in droves. Do you know what a drove is?
Well, actually, I'm not sure.
A drove is a group of animals. It could be cows or horses. That expression gives me the impression of people blindly following each other like animals. Oh, and there's one more animal that people associate with group pressure. They tell you not to be a copycat.
How would you define a copycat?
A copycat is a person who always copies what other people do. And in the U.S., that's not supposed to be a good thing. You know the song, Copycat, Copycat, Who Do You Think You're Looking At? That expression implies that you should not copy other people. But in Chinese culture, we emphasize being similar to other people. There's an Asian expression, it's Japanese actually, that says, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. That means that you should not try to be different.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 29. 1.
Well, the first thing you see is that adolescents begin to make fashion statements. And certainly those ideas don't come from you. You can tell at a glance that they don't come from you.
2.
My younger son began to ask if he could dye his hair blue.
And what did you say?
We said when he was a little older, he could make that decision, with the hope that that fad would have passed out of style. We told him he should be an individual.
3.
Where would you draw the line? I mean, presumably you'd let him wear whatever clothes he wants, but would you let him pierce his ears or dye his hair?
I think in the end, I would, but not without a fight.
4.
We have a different approach in my culture. I would never let my children dye their hair.
5.
When I first got to the U.S., I asked myself, who are they talking about? Who is number 1? And then I realized it's me.
Lecture. Ivan Zatz. Culture shock. Group pressure in action. Before the lecture. Organizational phrases. Page 34. Listen to these phrases from the lecture.
The subject of today's lecture is culture shock, group pressure in action. I'm going to focus on three main ideas of this lecture. First of all, we will consider the reasons why people experience culture shock. Secondly, I will describe the different stages of the experience. And finally, I'll mention some possible applications of this research. First, then, why do people experience culture shock? Now let's turn to the different stages of culture shock. To conclude, let's look at some practical applications of the research.
Lecture, Part 1. Reasons for culture shock. Organizing your notes in outline form. Page 35.
The subject of today's lecture is culture shock, group pressure in action. Culture shock, as you know, is the term used to describe the experience many people have when they travel to another country, and it can be seen as a manifestation of group pressure in action. It is a good example of group pressure because it shows what happens when an individual suddenly experiences different cultural rules, the rules of another cultural group. Now, culture shock is a complex phenomenon, but I'm going to focus on three main ideas of this lecture. First of all, we will consider the reasons why people experience culture shock. Secondly, I will describe the different stages of the experience. And finally, I'll mention some possible applications of this research. Because although you might think that culture shock affects, say, only travelers, that is not the case. In fact, cross-cultural studies have immense practical value for modern society. First, then, why do people experience culture shock? Think about this for a minute. When you grow up in a particular set of surroundings, naturally, you get used to the rules and guidelines that govern the behavior of the people around you. In a sense, you become totally dependent on the rules of your social group. You tend not to question them, you just accept them without thinking. Now, these rules are often not clearly articulated, and therefore, you're not aware of their impact. In other words, you are not necessarily conscious of them. They only become important when, for example, you go to another country or a different environment that's governed by a different set of rules. In fact, this experience can be so shocking that it has been compared to having a bucket of cold water thrown over you. Now, culture shock happens precisely because you cannot use your own culture as a map to guide your own behavior and your own understanding of what surrounds you. You're totally out of control, just as if you were driving along a highway in the dark without a road map. And because of this, people often behave irrationally. It's a highly stressful experience, and there are different symptoms in different stages.
Lecture, Part 2. Stages of culture shock. Using a lecturer's diagrams and charts. Page 37.
Now let's turn to the different stages of culture shock. Most researchers agree that there are three main stages. If you were to depict it on paper, you might draw a wave shape. The first stage, the crest, or highest part of the wave, is often referred to as the honeymoon stage. It's the time when you first arrive in a new culture and are confronted with a whole set of different rules. What are the emotions that you experience during this time? Even though this is a new and often strange experience, people don't usually react with fear. Surprisingly, there is often a feeling of euphoria. The most common reactions at this time are excitement, fascination, and enthusiasm. Of course, you're on your guard because of the strangeness of the situation. But at this stage, cultural differences are likely to seem exciting rather than threatening. The second stage has been called the letdown. Here are some feelings that people experience during this phase. Irritation, hostility, and confusion. They might also feel exhausted, lonely, and nervous. Now, these feelings happen because travelers and others have to unlearn their own cultural habits and values as they spend more time in a new country and are expected to function according to the ways of that place. They excuse me, they may feel like lost children without protection. They probably want to go home, but if they can't do that, they spend a lot of time with other people from their own country in order to get back a sense of safety. Now, the final stage is one of resignation. Even if visitors aren't completely comfortable, they do become adjusted to the new environment, or at least they stop feeling that they need to defend their own culture every time they encounter a habit or value they don't easily recognize. They might never recapture the honeymoon period, but they're not as depressed as they were during stage 2. To conclude, let's look at some practical applications of the research. Well, remember I mentioned that it doesn't just apply to tourists on vacation or even international students. In our world of rapid transportation and population mobility, many societies have recent immigrants, sometimes in large numbers. This becomes a general social challenge because immigrants are going through even more cultural shock than tourists. Furthermore, older residents of a country with large numbers of new immigrants can experience their own form of internal culture shock when they see neighborhoods or even large regions where people speak a foreign language or eat unfamiliar food or behave according to cultural patterns brought from their own countries. Now, because cultural differences can sometimes lead to tense relationships between different ethnic groups, it is vital that people try to learn as much as possible. Get some cross-cultural training, if they can, about the different cultures in their own societies. Because the more we learn about our differences, the easier it is to live in a world where different cultures have to live in close contact with each other.
Unit 2, Gender in Society. Chapter 3, Gender Roles. Getting started. Building background knowledge on the topic. Page 46.
Oh, I remember Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack wastes all his family's money, but then he plants a beanstalk and he climbs it and meets a giant. I think he kills the giant and gets all his money. This is a great story. I think it shows Jack as a boy who is independent and strong-willed. He's also really adventurous and athletic. And the story has a happy ending.
Ah, The Ugly Duckling. Isn't that the one where there is a baby swan that gets raised with a family of ducks? At first he thinks he's really ugly, but he's just different. When he grows up, he becomes a beautiful swan. We all hear this story when we are children. I think it's good for all kids, boys and girls. But it's especially good for boys because it shows that they can be timid and sensitive.
Little Red Riding Hood. She goes alone through the forest to take some fruit to her grandmother, and then she gets eaten by the big bad wolf. But as I remember, she gets rescued by a woodsman. I suppose this shows girls as being very gentle and sweet and helpless and vulnerable. The male characters are different. The wolf is aggressive and bad, and the woodsman is brave and strong. That story's probably showing a lot of stereotypes about males and females. I never really thought about it before.
Interview 1. Bringing up children. Answering multiple choice questions. Page 50.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for talking to me. You have 2 kids, a girl and a boy, right?
Yeah, that's right. My daughter is 12 and my son is 10.
Do you think parents raise boys and girls differently?
Yeah, I think most parents do, but my wife and I decided when they were born that we wanted to raise them pretty much the same. We said we wanted to give them the same opportunities and the same kind of experiences.
And what happened?
Well, it's a funny thing. Like I told you, our daughter Isla was older, and we just assumed that when our son Rowan was born, he would behave exactly the same as she did. But guess what? He was completely different.
How so?
Well, for instance, he was always dragging himself around on the floor, jumping into water, getting dirty, and breaking things. It was incredible. We had to lock all the cupboards in the house. He just couldn't sit still. We weren't ready for that because we expected him to be a bit more quiet like she was.
Didn't your daughter get dirty too?
Well, she did sometimes. I mean, she was a regular kid, but she was a typical girl. There was one stage when she would only wear pink. Pink, pink, pink. And all her friends dressed in pink too. And even when she was small, our daughter listened to us when we told her what to do and what not to do. I remember one time we had to take both of them to the doctor's for a shot. My daughter went first, and she was really brave. She patiently waited for the doctor to do what he needed, and she didn't even cry. The next week, we took my son. He kicked the doctor and ran away. I still remember the look on the doctor's face. He couldn't believe it.
Do you think that your children were just born differently? I mean, is this behavior innate, do you think? I'm talking about the nature-nurture debate.
Yes, I think there are differences between boys and girls. Of course, I know they are exposed to stereotypes about gender roles on TV and wherever they go. But I'm telling you that from the minute they were born, my own children acted in completely different ways. So I guess nature does play a big role.
Thanks, Andrew. And hi, Linda. Can you tell me what it was like for you to raise your son? What were your goals for him as he grew up?
I think the most critical issue for me was to raise a son who would be proud of being himself and who would grow up to be a good friend to others, then a good parent and a good husband. And I wanted him to be aware of the issues that girls have.
And how are boys' issues different from girls?
Boys tend to be more competitive. They're just born that way. They're expected to be a lot tougher. For example, they're expected to excel in sports because for boys, a lot of social relationships and friendships grow out of sports. So people always ask them, "Who are you playing basketball with?" Or, "Are you on the football team?" I think that girls tend to form groups more easily without sports.
I read somewhere that men need to do something, like sports, as you say, to get together.
Yeah, that's true. When boys are younger, school brings them together. But older boys and men tend to use sports as that thing they do together. They talk about sports all the time, and there's a major bonding that goes on around sports.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
And some people think that boys are closed emotionally, but I think that boys share a lot of their intimate feelings with other boys. Of course, they tease each other very harshly, but they're open about things that scare them.
What kinds of things do you think boys are scared of?
I think they're scared of not being accepted, of not being liked, of not being intelligent enough, of not being strong enough, of not being fast enough, of not being attractive enough. There is so much pressure on them to succeed.
Are boys different from girls in that way?
Well, I think they both face challenges. They both have to face stereotypes and deal with people's expectations about how they should behave, but the stereotypes about boys and girls are different.
Interview 2. Growing up as a boy or girl. Listening for specific information. Page 51.
Thank you all for coming today. I'd like you to talk about your family. Please begin by telling me how many siblings you had and whether they were boys or girls. Then explain to me if you were treated the same or differently from your siblings. Joy, why don't you begin?
Sure. Well, there are 3 of us in my family. I have a sister who's older and a brother who's 5 years younger. And I do not think that we were raised the same. My brother was given a lot more freedom than we were.
Can you give me an example?
Well, when we were teenagers, my sister and I always had to be home before 10, even on weekends. After that, my parents would be calling us on the phone every few minutes saying, "Are you coming home yet? Where are you? Are you safe?" and stuff like that. But my brother, there didn't seem to be any curfew for him. When he was about 15 or 16, it would be about midnight before he came home, or even later. And just because he was a boy, he got away with it. My sister and I were older by then, but I remember being really jealous.
Thank you, Joy. Sharon, what about you?
Well, I was an only child, so I'm not sure if I can really judge. But I have to say that I was encouraged to do anything I wanted. My parents didn't shelter me or treat me any differently because I was a girl. In fact, they really let me do whatever I wanted, and they supported me. For example, when I was small, I got really interested in music, and I always wanted to play the saxophone. I remember distinctly that my grandmother said, "A saxophone is a big instrument for such a little girl. Why don't you get her to play violin instead?"
So what happened?
"No," my mother said. "She wants to play the saxophone." So they gave me lessons, and I was really good at it. I joined a band when I was in high school, and I'm still in a band now I'm in college. I never wanted to play any other instrument.
David, let's hear your story.
I have one brother, very close in age, and I think my parents treated us both equally, even though we were very different.
In what way?
I was quite outgoing, but my brother was really shy. I liked sports, but he really didn't. He has always been pretty artistic, and he preferred to spend more time reading and drawing and things like that.
So, if you were so different, why do you say that your parents treat you the same?
Well, in the sense that they respected our decisions. For instance, I remember that once we were both asked to join a baseball team, and we did. But my brother absolutely hated it. He used to get upset every time there was a practice, and he told my father that he didn't want to be on the team. So you know what my father did? He said, "Okay, that's fine," and he took him off the team.
That was very supportive of him. Thank you, David. Now, Peter, you're last. Can you tell us about your family?
I have a younger sister, and I wish my parents had treated us more the same. I have to say that they really didn't allow her to do the things I did. They were much more protective of her, and I think she really resented it.
What did they do?
Well, when we were in high school, they had a study abroad trip, and I was allowed to go away for a month, no questions asked. But when it was her turn to go, they gave her a really hard time. They kept asking her who she would be with and where she would be staying. She finally got frustrated and angry with them. But they said that because she was a girl, they were just trying to watch out for her. I felt so sorry for her because I think she needed more freedom.
Listening for opinions. Page 52.
Do you think parents raise boys and girls differently?
Yeah, I think most parents do. But you know, my wife and I decided when they were born that we wanted to raise them pretty much the same.
Didn't your daughter get dirty too?
Well, she did sometimes. I mean, she was a regular kid, but she was a typical girl. There was one stage when she would only wear pink. Pink, pink, pink. And all her friends dressed in pink too.
You know, I read somewhere that men need to do something, like sports, as you say, to get together.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
There are 3 of us in my family. I have a sister who's older and a brother who's 5 years younger. And I do not think that we were raised the same.
Well, I was an only child, so I'm not sure if I can really judge. But I have to say that I was encouraged to do anything I wanted.
I have one brother, very close in age. And I think my parents treated us both equally, even though we were very different.
I have a younger sister, and I wish my parents had treated us more the same. I have to say that they really didn't allow her to do the things I did.
Lecture. Mary Frosch. The Benefits of Single-Gender Education for Girls. Before the lecture. Using symbols and abbreviations. Page 57.
I've been asked to speak to you today about the benefits of single-sex education. Many of the arguments that I'll make apply to both boys and girls. But I'm a teacher and advisor in an all-girls school, so I'm particularly aware of the benefits of single-sex schooling for girls. Of course, I understand that choosing the right kind of education for a child is a personal choice, and I certainly respect that choice. I also recognize that there are some strong arguments against single-sex schooling and in favor of coeducation. So in the first part of my lecture, I'd like to discuss 3 drawbacks of all-girls schools.
Lecture. Part 1. Pros and Cons of Single-Gender Education for Girls. Using symbols and abbreviations. Page 60.
I've been asked to speak to you today about the benefits of single-sex education. Many of the arguments that I'll make apply to both boys and girls. But I'm a teacher and advisor in an all-girls school, so I'm particularly aware of the benefits of single-sex schooling for girls. Of course, I understand that choosing the right kind of education for a child is a personal choice, and I certainly respect that choice. I also recognize that there are some strong arguments against single-sex schooling and in favor of coeducation. So in the first part of my lecture, I'd like to discuss 3 drawbacks of all-girls schools. First of all, critics of all-girls schools argue that the separation of the sexes seems old-fashioned. They point out in the United States, single-sex education was much more popular at the beginning of the 20th century, before the feminist movement that began in the early 1960s. These critics say that having separate schools for boys and girls goes against the aims and the goal of feminist and liberal educators, which is to provide fairness, to make sure boys and girls have the same educational opportunities and are treated in the same way. Secondly, the critics say that single-sex schools are artificial. In single-sex schools, boys and girls are separated and can't develop the ability to interact with one another or feel comfortable in each other's company. These critics say that in single-sex schools, children never get to learn about gender differences. In coeducational settings, of course, they get to interact on a daily basis. But in single-sex schools, they not only miss out on the chance to sit in class together, but neither do they have lunch together, play sports together, or join clubs together. In other words, and this is the third drawback, single-sex schools don't offer children a smooth transition into the real world after school, the adult world, where men and women live together. In single-sex schools, boys and girls cannot become prepared for a world in which they will compete, work, play, and live together as adults. Now, definitely, these are serious arguments against separating girls from boys in school, but there are pros and cons to any situation. And in this case, I believe that the advantages of single-sex education outweigh the disadvantages. And that's why I'm in favor of all girls and all boys schools. In the second part of the lecture, I'd like to focus on the 2 main reasons why I support single-sex education for girls in particular. It values girls' unique qualities, and it helps girls develop self-confidence.
Lecture, Part 2. Two main benefits of all girls' schools. Using your notes to make an outline. Page 62.
The first real benefit of all girls' education is that it recognizes girls' unique qualities, the qualities that make them different from boys. What are these unique qualities? Well, I'm going to list a few. First of all, research has shown that the brain develops differently in boys and girls. Girls can often concentrate on higher-level abstract thinking about 4 years earlier than boys can, and they tend to use the areas of the brain devoted to language and emotional functioning. Furthermore, they can often work for longer periods of time. Girls enjoy collaborative learning activities, and so they work well in groups. Boys tend to be more attracted to visual, hands-on learning activities. Finally, as girls mature, they're often kind and cooperative. These qualities are valued in all girls' schools. The second benefit of single-sex education is that girls become more self-confident without the distraction of boys. In a single-sex environment, girls enjoy being leaders. They offer help to others, and they also ask for help when they need it. For example, if they don't understand a math or science concept, they'll ask for clarification. But when girls are in the same classroom as boys, they often lose their self-esteem because they have very different learning styles than boys. Boys tend to be louder. They may jump up out of their seats and wave their arms in people's faces if they know the answer to a teacher's question. If this happens, girls typically sink back in their chairs and wait for the boys to quiet down. But if there are no boys around, girls can feel free to be themselves. Now, it's true that recently girls have been doing very well in school, better than boys in many cases. Second, we have to realize that there are valid reasons for supporting coeducation, and in many cases, it comes down to personal preference. And it's also true that all girls' schools do separate girls from the real world while they're growing up. But in the real adult world, boys are the ones who set the rules of the game. And these rules don't necessarily reflect the needs or talents of girls, no matter how well they do in school. In an all-girls school, girls can become confident enough to challenge the rules. And then, perhaps, they can change the real world into a place designed to help both women and men.
Unit 2. Gender in Society. Chapter 4. Gender Issues Today. Getting started. Listening for specific information. Page 66. 1. The employee is going to get married.
If the employee is a man, people think he'll work harder because he'll need to keep his job. But if the employee is a woman, people often think that she'll have a baby and leave her job.
2. The employee has a family picture on his or her desk.
If the employee is a man, people think he loves his family. But if the employee is a woman, people think she's more interested in her husband and her children than she is in her career.
3. The employee is talking with a coworker.
If the employee is a man, people think they're talking about something important. But if the employee is a woman, people usually think they're just chatting.
4. The employee is going to go on a business trip.
If the employee is a man, people think the trip will be good for his career, but if the employee is a woman, they say, "What will her husband think?"
Interview 1. Gender discrimination in the workplace. Answering multiple choice questions. Page 69.
Belinda, do you think you've ever been discriminated against because you're a woman?
Well, let's see. I have two answers for that. The first answer is yes. That's my gut feeling. But sometimes I think no. I'm not being discriminated against. I just need to try harder. I guess I'm saying yes and no. Look, we're in a society where, yes, discrimination is definitely going on in the business world. I see women getting paid less than men do for the same position, something like 20 to 30% less in some cases. And often you'll see that women get jobs as assistants, but they're the ones who are doing all the work. That's absolutely awful.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Also, there's this old boys club, the support network that men have. Men do help each other, there's no question about it.
So then, you're saying that men do have an easier time of it in the workplace?
Yeah, I suppose I am. It is easier for men. But I have mixed feelings about the whole situation. Sometimes I think that I'm just making excuses for myself. What I ask myself is, am I good enough? Am I as good as the men? Perhaps I'm not. See, I really believe that if I do the work necessary in the business world, I'll be able to be as successful as any man. I think that there's much more of a level playing field than there was before. There's much more opportunity now for women than when I was younger.
And do you think successful women help other women?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do. Women tend to think of helping themselves and helping other people too. And I hope that I can help to increase the opportunities for many young girls, as well as boys. It's a question of helping everyone to do their best.
Interview 2. Gender inequality at home and in the workplace. Answering true-false questions. Page 70.
I'd like to ask your opinion about how gender roles are changing. Some people say there is more equality now. Do you agree?
No, I don't, because that's absolutely not true. The first thing is that there is still a pay disparity. Women make only about 70% of the dollar that men earn. There have been changes in the last 20 years or so, but they've been relatively modest. And there's still that glass ceiling, where women hit this invisible barrier as they try to move up.
Could you give me an example of the glass ceiling?
Well, look at this. I'm a social worker. 90% of my colleagues are women, so that's a ratio of about 1 to 9. But both the CEO and his boss are men. So the top executives are men, and the lower paid levels, most of them are women. I think that men are much more likely to be raised with a sense of entitlement than women.
And what about equality at home?
I don't think there's equality there either. You see, I think that gender differences often operate on unconscious levels. It almost never occurs to men that they can do housework just as well as women, or take care of children, even if they're divorced and have custody of a child. But women have been parenting children alone forever, and women just assume that they can do it.
How has this affected you in your own life?
Well, with both my children, from 2 different marriages, I was always the person who got up at night and gave the baby a bottle. I was always very actively involved with caring for my children, cooking for them, and I joined a playgroup with my son 25 years ago. Incidentally, I was the only male involved, and I loved it.
Good for you.
That was very, very different from my father's generation. My father had almost nothing to do with us until we were 8 or 10. Of course, he held us and gave us some smiles and so on, but he wasn't really an active parent. But I was determined to be a part of the joy of it all.
So what you're saying is that the situation has changed, but there's still inequality.
Oh yes, I think that's true. Absolutely.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 71. Excerpt 1.
Belinda, do you think you've ever been discriminated against because you're a woman?
Well, let's see. I have 2 answers for that. The first answer is yes. That's my gut feeling. But sometimes I think no. I'm not being discriminated against. I just need to try harder. I guess I'm saying yes and no.
Excerpt 2.
I think that there's much more of a level playing field than there was before. There's much more opportunity now for women than when I was younger.
Excerpt 3.
Do you think successful women help other women?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do.
Excerpt 4.
I'd like to ask your opinion about how gender roles are changing. Some people say there is more equality now. Do you agree?
No, I don't, because that's absolutely not true.
Excerpt 5.
My father had almost nothing to do with us until we were 8 or 10. Of course, he held us and gave us some smiles and so on, but he wasn't really an active parent.
Lecture. Wendy Gavis. Gender and Language. Before the lecture. Using telegraphic language. Page 76. 1.
It's a question of equality. For example, when you say mankind, it sounds as if you're only talking about men, but when you say human beings or people, then you include both men and women.
2.
Why should we use gender-neutral language? Well, first of all, it describes the world the way it really is, as I said. And secondly, it carries positive connotations, or images. If children grow up hearing the word chairman, then they internalize the idea that all leaders are men, which isn't true.
3.
The title of this lecture is Gender and Language. I'm going to specifically discuss the topic of sexism in language. I'll describe what this is, and then discuss ways to avoid it.
4.
It turns out that language conveys a lot of messages about gender, and a clear example is what we call gender-specific terms. Many terms, like mailman or policeman, are gender-specific. They all refer to men, yet there are women who do these jobs.
Lecture. Part 1. Gender-specific and gender-neutral language. Using telegraphic language. Page 78.
Good morning. Please take notes on today's lecture. Everyone should pick up his pen. Or rather, everyone should pick up her pen. Or everyone should pick up his or her pen. Or her or his pen. Wait, let me start again. Everyone should pick up their pen. Is that correct? You get my point, right? In the sentence I just said about picking up your pen, I was forced to choose a pronoun. And when I did that, I faced a difficult choice about how to address my audience. The title of this lecture is Gender and Language. I'm going to specifically discuss the topic of sexism in language. I'll describe what this is, and then discuss ways to avoid it. First then, is it true that language can be sexist? The answer is yes, it can. Take the example of this word, Mr. What word has the same meaning for women? Well, as any student of the English language knows, there is none. There's Mrs., which means I'm married. There's Miss, which means I'm not married. And then, since the 1970s, we've had Ms., which means it's none of your business whether I'm married or not. Well, not exactly, but you get my point, right? After all, men don't have to let you know their marital status. They're all called Mr. In fact, it turns out that language conveys a lot of messages about gender, and a clear example is what we call gender-specific terms. Many terms, like mailman or policeman, are gender-specific. They all refer to men, yet there are women who do these jobs. Increasingly so, in fact. So what do we do? Well, a safe option is to use what we call gender-neutral terms, such as mail carrier or police officer. Why should we use gender-neutral language? Well, first of all, it describes the world the way it really is, as I said. And secondly, it carries positive connotations, or images. If children grow up hearing the word chairman, then they internalize the idea that all leaders are men, which isn't true. Third, it's a question of equality. For example, when you say mankind, it sounds as if you're only talking about men, but when you say human beings or people, then you include both men and women. But we need to look beyond using non-sexist vocabulary. Grammar is a problem too. Do you remember the example I gave at the beginning? everyone should pick up blank pen. Well, I wasn't really making a joke. The fact is I have to choose a pronoun, and I don't want to give the impression that everyone in the room is male or female either. So I'm facing a dilemma. What's the solution? Well, personally, I prefer to say everyone should pick up their pen. I realize this is not grammatically correct, but it does avoid sexism, and as far as I'm concerned, that's very important. Incidentally, you'll find that most university professors and writers would probably make the same choice that I do. Pick up the newspaper, or look around you on the bus or on the subway, and you'll see plural pronouns in places you might not expect.
Lecture, Part 2, Questions and Answers. Using telegraphic language. Page 79.
Now I'd like to organize the second part of the lecture around your questions. I can see that some of you have questions on your mind, so please, go ahead and ask them.
Professor Gavis, I'm sorry, but is all this concern about language really important? I mean, aren't there more serious issues facing women today?
You know, I understand what you're saying, and of course there are many serious issues facing women. I mean, there are so many that I could mention. The AIDS crisis, workplace inequality, the way the mass media treats women, that is, the way they stereotype women, and so on. But I'd like to point out that in addition to these issues, the language question is also on the minds of international organizations, such as the United Nations, who try very hard to avoid sexism in their publications. You see, the issue isn't just the words themselves, but the ideas behind the words. Have you ever thought about the roles that boys and girls play in children's literature? It often seems that the boys are the ones having all the fun, having adventures and so on, while the girls just stand in the background, smiling sweetly. Women tend to be pushed to the background in society. By focusing on the language we use about women, we may be able to change their expectations.
I have a question about the relationship between the way we think and the way we talk. For example, if we say chair instead of chairman, do you really think we'll start imagining more women in powerful positions?
Again, that's a very interesting question. And yes, it's true that we don't completely understand the relationship between language and thought. So, does what we say affect what we think? The answer is probably yes. I, for one, would say that if we speak about people in certain ways, that definitely has an influence on the way we think about them. Imagine a little girl who grows up hearing chairman, chairman, chairman. What is she going to think of when she hears this word? Well, a man, of course. But we must give young people the idea that women can also enter the professional world and be successful. Any more questions?
Professor Gavis, does this controversy about how we use language exist in other languages too?
Yes, it's definitely receiving more and more attention worldwide, but remember that the feminist movement, which is so active in the United States, has been a major force behind the move to avoid sexist language. It's a complicated issue, however, because the issues of gender in language change from one language to the next. For example, nouns don't have a gender in English, but there are two genders for nouns in Spanish, masculine and feminine. And German has 3 gender groups. Some nouns are masculine, others are feminine, and then there's a third category, which isn't masculine or feminine. So each language has its own gender issues. You might want to take a look at some newspapers or magazines to see how they avoid sexism in English. Well, we have to leave it there for today. Thank you.
Unit 3, Media and Society. Chapter 5, Mass Media Today. Getting started. Listening for specific information. Page 92. 1.
Hi, where do you get your news?
Oh, well, I usually check the headlines on my iPod as soon as I wake up. I like to know what's going on in the world, don't you?
2.
How much news do you read?
I usually read a paper online. I read all the headlines and usually 2 or 3 articles.
3.
Do you buy a newspaper every day?
No way. I prefer to read the news online.
4.
Do you keep up with the news on a daily basis?
No, not really. I check it pretty often, but probably not every day.
5.
Do you share your opinions about the news on a blog or social media site?
Sure, I often do that. It's fun to exchange ideas with other people.
Unit 3. Media and Society. Chapter 5. Mass Media Today. Getting started. Listening for specific information. Page 92. 1.
Hi, where do you get your news?
Oh, well, I usually check the headlines on my iPod as soon as I wake up. I like to know what's going on in the world, don't you?
2.
How much news do you read?
I usually read a paper online. I read all the headlines and usually 2 or 3 articles.
3.
Do you buy a newspaper every day?
No way. I prefer to read the news online.
4.
Do you keep up with the news on a daily basis?
No, not really. I check it pretty often, but probably not every day.
5.
Do you share your opinions about the news on a blog or social media site?
Sure, I often do that. It's fun to exchange ideas with other people.
Interview 1. Problems with TV news. Answering multiple choice questions. Page 94.
Hi, Carol. I'd like to get your opinion about news in the United States.
Well, I have very strong opinions about it. We think we're getting the news, but it's really just entertainment. The news is based on what's going to keep people tuned in, like plastic surgery or celebrities. They actually tease you to get you to watch the news with those stories because I think they think Americans get bored with international news.
You're talking about news on TV?
Yeah. I mean, of course, I read the news online, too, but mainly I try to catch up with it in the evenings while I'm cooking.
Oh, yes, I do that too.
Yeah, the announcers say, "Tune in at 11. Find out how this woman lost weight." And that kind of keeps people watching. And that's what they call news. But what about major political problems? Those don't get reported in the way they should be. They don't get reported enough.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
The other thing that bothers me about the news is that it's shallow. Like, there are these people doing voiceovers, but the voiceovers have the same tone as people who do it for movies. It's like 6 guns to kill, and then it's like plastic surgery at 11. And it's the same voice, the same style for those 2 stories. It's all like entertainment.
Do you think entertainment is more interesting than news?
Good question. I actually think we've gotten used to the idea that news should be just as entertaining as the movies. And it should be quick and sort of like instant gratification.
What do you mean?
They present something that doesn't require you to think. Easy information. You feel like you're learning something, but you really aren't. The information you're getting might be immediate, but it's shallow. And the TV news has to be reported by people who are physically attractive. If they're not attractive, viewers complain.
Well, do you think newspapers, online or the actual papers, give you better news coverage than TV?
I think newspapers are better because they're more in-depth. But then who has time to really read them?
Do you get any news from radio or the internet? Are they better? I mean, are there any good places to get news?
I do think there are better places, but you have to spend time finding them. And people need quick access. If you want to get specialized news, you have to go to special radio stations or websites, and I don't even know what those are. So I guess I'm saying that good news is hard to find.
So where do you get your news?
Mostly on TV. That's the thing. I realize I'm being sucked into it, so I'm critical of it, but it's okay because I know I'm being sucked in.
Interview 2. Opinions about the news. Listening for main ideas. Page 95. 1.
Hi, Lewis. Now, you say that you're not really interested in the news. Why not?
Well, I think it's a giant waste of time, and I can't understand why people seem so obsessed with current events. I mean, I know that it's important to understand what's going on in the world, but you don't have to follow things every single second. For example, suppose there's a disaster somewhere on the other side of the world. Do I have to know what's happening immediately? I don't see why I do. There's nothing I can do to help, and it really doesn't affect me that much.
I don't think most people would agree with you.
Maybe not. But I think it is a problem that we are all connected to electronics all the time. There is no person-to-person communication. We need to get off Facebook, take a break, get involved in travel, in nature, in discussions with those around us. We're bombarded by the news 24/7, and that is very unhealthy.
2.
Peter, what do you think?
Lewis, I can't believe you're saying that. I'm sorry, but I disagree with you. I think that it's the responsibility of every educated, intelligent person to keep up with what is going on in the world. So I'm extremely interested in the news, especially current events. I'm constantly checking news updates online.
What do you read online? The newspapers?
Yes, because you can trust that they are accurate. But I also read blogs because they have a different perspective, and that's where you get the breaking news. Let's face it, timing is everything. If you find out about something after the fact, then it's not news anymore.
Don't you think that some of the blogs are biased?
We read a lot of half-truths. That's why you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But if you are exposed to more than one opinion, you have a much better chance of understanding the issues. That's the great thing about the digital revolution. It allows us to participate in sharing information.
3.
Sharon, what about you?
Okay. Well, like most people my age, I get most of my news on the internet. But I read papers too. And what I notice is that the news is really depressing, especially the main headlines, accidents and tragedies. I find more and more that the news in the United States is getting focused on negative things.
Is that your only concern?
No, there's something else. In addition to being so depressing, I think most news is also one-sided. It's all about where you are. I know that people are interested in local news, but I think the news should be more well-rounded. I mean, U.S. newspapers should give news from the United States, but they shouldn't forget other parts of the world.
If you don't like the news, why don't you turn it off, as Lewis was saying?
Well, I must admit I do like the news. I especially like the arts and culture, and also the human interest stories, which can be really uplifting. I like to read about people. It makes you feel positive instead of depressed and helpless.
4.
Bobby, you also said you find the news annoying. Is that why you don't watch it?
Yeah, I'm not interested in the news at all. If you turn on the TV, which of course I do sometimes, it's all about celebrities. Who got married, who went to a party, who has a new car. I can't understand why people are so obsessed by it. Also, I think there should be some restrictions on the paparazzi. When the media is allowed to get into every detail of people's lives, that's an invasion of privacy.
Don't you think it's normal for people to be interested in colorful stories about famous people?
Actually, no. I think we should be more interested in the people around us.
Listening for stressed words. Page 96. 1.
Hi, Lewis. Now, you say that you're not really interested in the news. Why not?
Well, I think it's a giant waste of time, and I can't understand why people seem so obsessed with current events.
2.
What do you read online? The newspapers?
Yes, because you can trust that they are accurate.
3.
If you don't like the news, why don't you turn it off, as Lewis was saying?
Well, I must admit, I do like the news.
4.
Bobby, you also said you find the news annoying. Is that why you don't watch it?
Yeah, I'm not interested in the news at all.
Lecture. Sarah Coleman. From Event to Story. Making it to the news. Before the lecture. Listening for signal words. Page 102. 1.
Nowadays, more than ever before, we are surrounded by news.
2.
In fact, so many news stories appear every day that it's impossible to keep up with them.
3.
First of all, there are different kinds of journalists.
4.
Sometimes journalists are called reporters because they report the news.
5.
Usually, unplanned events are more exciting.
6.
However, it's important not to report too much personal information or anything that is scandalous.
Lecture, Part 1. The Work of a Journalist. Choosing a format for organizing your notes. Page 104.
Nowadays, more than ever before, we are surrounded by news. You can get the news on the internet, on TV, on the radio, and in newspapers. In fact, so many news stories appear every day that it's impossible to keep up with them. And behind all of these stories, there's a journalist. First of all, there are different kinds of journalists, like entertainment journalists, sports journalists, and crime journalists. And they all work hard to deliver the news 24 hours a day, in print and increasingly online. So how exactly do they find and write stories? Let's look at the work of one type of journalist, a city reporter. Sometimes journalists are called reporters because they report the news. So a city reporter is a person assigned to find and write stories about local news. How does the reporter do her work? Well, to begin with, she should keep in contact with lots of different organizations, the local police and fire departments, the offices of local politicians, and religious and civic organizations in the neighborhood. Once the reporter has a good relationship with these organizations, she can call them to see what's happening, or they might call her to tell her about something that's going on. There are two kinds of stories she could write about. The first is a planned event for which the reporter can anticipate many of the details. For example, a politician could be opening a new department store. The second is an unplanned event, for example, a fire or a crime. Usually, unplanned events are more exciting. Let's look at one kind of unplanned event, a crime. Imagine that a fight breaks out between four men in a neighborhood bar, and one of the men threatens another with a knife. The reporter will probably see a few lines about the crime in the police log. Once she knows where it happened, she can go to the scene of the crime and interview people. The first person she will want to interview is a police officer so that she can get the facts. There are 4 very important facts that every reader wants to know at the beginning of every story. 1. What happened? 2. When did it happen? 3. Where did it happen? And 4. Who was involved? Once the reporter has the basic facts of the story, she can begin to interview witnesses. When you're interviewing witnesses, it's very important to get each witness's full name and some other details, perhaps the person's job or age. These details will make the story more interesting and credible. However, it's important not to report too much personal information or anything that is scandalous.
When the reporter has finished interviewing people, she'll go back to the newsroom to write the story. At that point, she might talk to her editor to decide whether she has a good story. Together, the reporter and editor must decide whether the reporter has enough facts and material to make a good story. Is it clear what happened and why?
Lecture, Part 2. Getting a story into print. Choosing a format for organizing your notes. Page 107.
The single most important question of all is whether or not the story is accurate. If a newspaper publishes a story that isn't supported by facts and somebody finds a mistake, then the newspaper's reputation will be damaged for a long time. For example, if the paper publishes a story saying that Bill Jones started the fight, and later it turns out that Fred Porter started the fight, there would be a problem. First of all, the public would have been misinformed, and people might decide not to access that paper in the future. Secondly, Bill Jones could decide to sue the paper for misrepresenting his character. That's called libel, and it's something that judges take very seriously. That's why many newspapers insist on having every controversial fact in a story supported by 2 different sources. If 2 people who don't know each other both tell the reporter that Bill Jones started the fight, then the newspaper feels it can publish the story. But checking every fact with 2 different sources takes a long time, and there isn't much time in the news world. Yesterday's news isn't worth much to the public, and every newspaper wants to be the first to publish a story. A reporter who has a big story will always want to publish it as soon as possible. So it's the editor's job to check that the reporter has done her work thoroughly and that there are no uncorroborated facts. But let's suppose that the reporter has done her job well. She's checked all the facts and she knows that she's got interesting interviews. Now she just has to write the story. Easy, right? Well, not always. Remember how quickly most people read newspapers? A journalist must know how to organize a difficult story and present it very clearly in language that's simple but very effective. When the story is written, it goes into the computer. Somebody checks that the story is grammatically accurate, and somebody else checks it for typing mistakes. Then a photograph or video is chosen to go with the story, and the editor-in-chief decides where to put the story, on the printed page or online. And what makes a good story? Well, there are 3 main things. First of all, the story has to be new. If it happened 3 months ago, it isn't news. Second, it has to be unusual. There's an old saying in the newsroom: if a dog bites a man, it isn't news. But if a man bites a dog, that's news. Third, it has to be something interesting that your readers want to know about. After all, if they don't want to know about it, they won't buy your newspaper.
Unit 3. Media and Society. Chapter 6. Impact of the Media on Our Lives. Getting Started. Recording Numerical Information. Page 110.
The map you see shows 2 pieces of information: the number of Internet users in 11 countries, and the percentage of the nation's population that uses the Internet. Let's begin with Australia, where as much as 80% of the population is online. Next, in the United States, 75% of the country uses the Internet. In South Korea, that figure is 76%. And in Japan, it is 74%. In the UK, the majority of people is also online. The percentage of Internet users is 72%. In Germany, it is also high. The percentage is 67%. And in France, it is 66%. In Brazil, the figure is much lower. Only 34% of the population uses the Internet. In China, that figure is 22%. The lowest figure on this map is India, where only 7% of the population is online.
Interview 1. The advantages of the media. Listening for specific information. Page 113.
Kelly, what is your opinion about the impact of the media? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
As a young person, I don't think that you have an option about whether you are going to participate or not in this technology. It is so ingrained in the world around us, and people use it for every purpose. For social purposes, for work, to follow the news, I can't think of a realm of life that computers have not penetrated. So, I don't know how productive discussions are about whether it is or isn't a good thing. We're past that. Everybody is using it, and you have to be engaged with it if you want to deal with the world around you. And it has many advantages.
So what are the advantages of the media?
I would say that the main appeal has to do with convenience. Instant communication, like you don't have to wait for anything. In the past, people went to the post office, which I think is an institution that is probably, not going to be here for very much longer. People used to have so much patience. You wrote letters, you put them in envelopes, you bought a stamp, you got to choose which one, you put your letter in the box, sent it off, and 5 or 10 days later, it got there. And that was fine for such a long time. But now people have realized that they don't have to wait. And now that they don't have to, they don't want to anymore. So I think time has become more important to people.
Are there any other advantages?
Yes. Sharing of information across the internet has really exploded, and I think that's a big part of the appeal. And I'm not just talking about words, but digital photos and videos too. My friends are constantly posting pictures about what they're doing, where they have been, hundreds of thousands. And it's really interesting because there is always new content to talk about. And you can pretty much use your phone to find out any information about where you are, how to get to different places, and even who is there that you know.
So you think the advantages include convenience and the ability to share information?
Yes. And then thirdly, everyone is connected now, so it's really easy to find your old friends. In the past, people fell out of touch, and you didn't necessarily have a way to get back in contact with them. Now that's not a concern anymore for my generation, because you can always find everyone. It's almost as if you don't exist if you don't use Facebook.
Isn't that an extreme statement?
Well, for people my age, 27, the online environment is absolutely central to our lives. But actually, I count myself as very lucky because I've been able to see a world with and without the internet. I remember getting a computer for the first time, so I have some perspective on its benefits. I actually have some nostalgia for the pre-technological age. I think children now are growing up with a very skewed impression of the world because for so many thousands of years, the world did not in any way resemble the potential of the modern world. So yeah, perhaps there is a downside to being so connected. Maybe we are losing a part of our cultural heritage, our humanity, by our addiction to the internet.
Interview 2. Disadvantages of the media. Listening for specific information. Page 114.
Nina, are there any disadvantages of the media?
Well, I think we are brainwashed by the media. It's getting harder and harder to think for yourself. And I also think the media interferes with the way we spend our time. It makes us antisocial.
In what way? Don't you think most people are talking to friends online?
I don't think that counts. People are not spending quality time together. It's fine to spend hours a day online, clicking here and clicking there. But 5 hours later, you suddenly realize that you haven't seen your family all day, and you've been sitting there chasing down all this information you think is so important. On one hand, it's wonderful to have the internet at your disposal. But while you're online, you're not doing anything else, like reading, for example. There's a way that books just bring knowledge alive to you in a completely different way. You get to discuss books with your friends. But all people talk about when they're discussing the internet is how much time they wasted.
Richard, I know you have strong feelings about the media.
I do. I've never had a television in my life. I grew up before television was really common, and I just don't have time for it. I think you have to look at the trade-off for whatever you do.
What do you mean by trade-off?
What it costs, not only in money, but in terms of what it does to your life. I have no real machines in my apartment. Well, I do have a radio, and I listen to good music. But I don't have a TV, and I don't have a cell phone either. You see, I think modern technology destroys all the beauty and meaning in life. The machine gets in the way, and I don't want to be part of a machine. That's not the way I want to live my life.
Aren't there any good things that the modern media brings us? I don't know, closer contact with other people?
Well, I do have a confession to make. The only modern form of media I really like is the jet plane. I mean, I know it's not the media, but I really consider it to be a form of communication. It has allowed me to travel all over the world. I get great enjoyment out of traveling. I link up with people from foreign countries. I meet them, I talk to them, and so in that way, the jet plane has improved international communication, much more than the internet will ever do.
What an interesting idea. Thank you, Richard. So then finally, Orlando.
The main disadvantage for me is that there is a digital divide. Is that what they call it? What I mean is that not everyone has equal access to the internet and modern technologies.
Who are you talking about?
Well, it's clear that some countries and some continents are less connected than others. The developed world has a great advantage over the developing world in that respect. But even within a country like the United States, where there is extensive internet access, the access is not even. That means there is a big gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that has all kinds of implications.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 115. 1. Kelly.
In the past, people went to the post office, which I think is an institution that is probably, not going to be here for very much longer.
2. Nina.
It's fine to spend hours a day online, clicking here and clicking there. But 5 hours later, you suddenly realize that you haven't seen your family all day, and you've been sitting there chasing down all this information you think is so important.
3. Richard.
I do have a confession to make. The only modern form of media I really like is the jet plane. I mean, I know it's not the media, but I really consider it to be a form of communication.
4. Orlando.
Even within a country like the United States, where there is extensive internet access, the access is not even. That means there is a big gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that has all kinds of implications.
Lecture. Deidre Smith. Dangers of the Mass Media. Before the lecture. Organizing your notes as a map. Page 119.
15 years ago, if you heard the words mass media, you probably immediately thought of television, newspapers, magazines, and the radio. But today, if you made a list of the mass media you use, you would have to add newer technologies such as smartphones, blogs, social media sites, and the internet. In today's world, we are surrounded by technology that allows us to communicate with others. And of course, technology has brought us some wonderful things, and I personally wouldn't want to live without it. But all these new advances bring us dangers that we should be aware of. There's a lot of violence in TV shows, and many people worry about its effect on us. In addition to making us violent, TV can also make us passive. Third, using the media can become very addictive.
Lecture, Part 1. Violence, Passivity, and Addiction. Organizing your notes as a map. Page 121.
15 years ago, if you heard the words mass media, you probably immediately thought of television, newspapers, magazines, and the radio. But today, if you made a list of the mass media you use, you would have to add newer technologies such as smartphones, blogs, social media sites, and the internet. In today's world, we are surrounded by technology that allows us to communicate with others. And of course, technology has brought us some wonderful things, and I personally wouldn't want to live without it. But all these new advances bring us dangers that we should be aware of. Let's begin by discussing 3 of these dangers: violence, passivity, and addiction. There's a lot of violence in TV shows, and many people worry about its effect on us. For example, almost every home in the United States has a color television, and according to a recent study, TV is on in the average household for 7 hours and 37 minutes every day. And many people are afraid that children and adolescents are especially susceptible to this violence. In 1993, for example, a young boy jumped out of a window after seeing a superhero do the same thing on TV while he was chasing an enemy. And what about the movie where kids set a subway booth on fire? Some teenagers saw that movie and they did the same thing. Tragically, the man working at the booth died as a result of the fire. In addition to making us violent, TV can also make us passive. You've probably heard the term couch potato. It refers to a person who daydreams for hours in front of the TV. When we are in this passive state, we may not be able to distinguish between fantasy and reality, and may make bad decisions about important things in our lives. Third, using the media can become very addictive. For example, how many internet users can say they quickly go online and find what they need and get off again? That's just not the case for most of us who wander through cyberspace, clicking here and there and wasting a lot of time in the process. If you check your email more than 3 or 4 times a day, you might want to ask yourself if you really need all that communication. And cell phones, which these days can also be used to go online, are highly addictive as well.
Lecture, Part 2. Advertising and Invasion of Privacy. Organizing your notes as a map. Page 123.
The fourth danger we should be concerned about is the increase in advertising. You see, the media is not only interested in providing information or entertainment, but also selling space or time to advertisers. You used to be able to enjoy a TV show or relax and read a magazine, and there wasn't too much advertising. Now, however, it seems that advertising is the main goal. Did you realize that the average consumer is exposed to 3,000 advertising messages a day? The content of a TV program or a magazine is just an excuse or a wrapping for the advertising. There's an essential marketing relationship among the media, the advertiser, and the user, and it exists whatever the media. Even print media, which is one of the least technological forms of communication, has a high percentage of ads. On TV, of course, we're used to being bombarded by endless commercials every 8 minutes. Many of us use our remote control to zap out the advertising with the mute button, or simply channel surf to find some place we can escape from the ads. But the advertisers have found many ways to get their message across to you anyway. They use what is called product placement, which means that they put products right in the middle of a show. For example, the hero of the show might be drinking a particular soft drink like Coca-Cola or Dr. Pepper, or he might be wearing a pair of shoes with the name Nike or Adidas. You can't escape from this form of advertising unless you just turn off your set. The problem is not just that we are being bombarded by advertising, but that the media is invading our privacy. Advertisers are more and more interested in getting private information about individuals. Every time you use your credit card, you're giving away information about yourself. Advertisers have the ability to gather statistical data about people like you, potential consumers. Think about this for a moment. Have you ever gotten junk mail from a company you've never heard of? Well, where did they get your address? Have you ever gotten a phone call during dinner from some company trying to sell you something? Where did they get your telephone number? Well, information about you can be compiled and sold to other companies, and advertisers can study what you buy, where you buy it, and how much of it you buy, and figure out the best way to make you buy more. On the internet, many websites are working extra hard to collect information about you. You can be tracked if you make a few visits to any website, and the data can be used to learn more about your habits, interests, and other behavior. We are surrounded everywhere by a message that tells us that we can be better, more successful, more popular, and altogether happier if we just have more. I believe we need to step back once in a while and ask ourselves if this message is true. Is it true? Are we what we buy? What if we couldn't buy anything, ever? Who would we be?
Unit 4. Breaking the Rules. Chapter 7. Crime and Criminals. Getting started. Building background knowledge. Technical terms. Page 133. 1.
A gold watch and a necklace were stolen from a home on Woodfield Avenue. The criminals entered the house through a bathroom window.
2.
A man was arrested at midnight on Harper Street because he was carrying a handgun without a license. He was taken to the police station for questioning.
3.
There's breaking news in the sexual assault case that we reported last week. Police have charged a man in connection with 2 similar cases that took place in the same neighborhood.
4.
A woman in her late 30s was found taking items from the local pharmacy. She was caught on camera as she was putting the items in her pocket.
5.
2 teenage boys were arrested for setting their school on fire. They entered the school after classes were over and set fire to the teacher's lounge. Luckily, no one was hurt.
6.
A car that was stolen from a supermarket parking lot was found near an old house by the railroad tracks. No one has been arrested yet in connection with the crime.
7.
A jealous ex-boyfriend has been charged in the killing of 2 young people in their 20s. The couple had been planning to get married.
Interview 1. Crime in Society Today. Answering True-False Questions. Page 135.
I'd like to ask both of you, now that you have a young child, whether you worry about the level of crime in the city.
Luckily, I've never actually been struck by crime. But now that we have Daniel, I've become more conscious of it.
What do you mean?
Well, personally, it doesn't affect me that much. But I hear so many stories and I see it on the TV news. So I'm aware of it and concerned about it. Sometimes I'm out late at night and I see big groups of kids roaming the streets. And that frightens me.
And you, Arpad?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. If it's a rowdy teenage group, I go over to the other side of the street. I'm tall, but still I try to avoid them.
And what I think is that they should be doing something else.
Do you worry that violence could affect your life?
I do, to be honest. Every time I get on the subway, I'm afraid that someone in the car could have a gun. Guns might not be visible, but they're everywhere. And at any minute, people can lose control. Guns are my biggest fear. I think guns are the biggest problem in the city.
And you, Arpad?
Well, I've never seen anyone with a gun, and much less seen a shooting. But just last week, someone got shot in a bookstore in the safest part of the city. It's very random. That's what worries me. There was another incident where a kid was asleep, and there was a shot from the apartment next door that went through the wall, and the bullet struck him in the leg. You're not even safe in your own house.
Why do you think there is so much crime?
Because kids think guns are ordinary. They're available. They're just facts of life. It's a recipe for disaster.
I think the kids don't have enough contact with their parents. Basically, kids who get into gangs don't have that much contact with other people. You know what I'm trying to say?
I agree with Evelina. Parents are the main people that need to be responsible for their children. My sister's a teacher, and she says it's amazing. Some parents think that school is responsible for teaching kids values, but that's not what I think.
So many problems come from the fact that parents can't spend enough time with their kids.
And gun control should be the government's responsibility. If there were fewer guns, that would definitely bring crime down.
Yeah, the government has such a slack attitude toward guns. I really agree with Arpad.
Interview 2. Being the victim of a crime. Listening for details. Page 137.
Gail, I know you've been the victim of a crime.
Unfortunately, yes. Once I was mugged by some young kids.
What happened?
I was going home late at night, and I couldn't see a single person on the street. And it was winter. Oh, it was so cold. So I had my scarf wrapped around my face. And then, suddenly, I walked straight into these 3 guys. They looked about 14 or 15. And they said something threatening like, "Give us all your money or we're gonna kill you." And I'm looking at them because they look so young. And I'm thinking, what on earth are you doing? They said, blah, 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 blah. And I said, listen, it's very cold. Give me a second. I have to take off my gloves.
You must have been really scared.
Well, I open my purse and all I've got is a few dollars. I was so nervous. And I say, here it is. And they say, $4? Yeah, it's $4. And they say, that's all you have?
So then what happened?
Well, I gave them the money and I just went home. But I felt so bad. You know, I really had mixed feelings about it. I wanted to say, guys, what are you doing? You know, go home. You're ruining your lives. And I think, why are those kids on the street doing things they're not supposed to? Something stupid, really stupid, that could lead to something worse.
Why do you think kids get involved in stealing?
I don't know. I mean, it was only $4. You look at kids getting involved in this kind of small crime and you think, who's responsible? I don't know what they were doing out on the street at that time of night.
Did you report the crime?
No, I didn't. Kids like that don't need prosecuting. They need parenting. They need someone to put them on the right path. These kids really need, help.
In what way?
Well, kids are so vulnerable. They have to get a lot of supervision. There are these kids hanging out on the street, doing things they're not supposed to. It's almost a macho type of thing. But I think if these kids had more self-esteem, they wouldn't behave in that way. We have to find ways to help these kinds of kids have good futures. Then they wouldn't commit crimes.
What about you, Tom? What was your experience?
Well, actually, I was robbed several times. The worst time was when my apartment was burglarized. I got home and saw the lock on my door had been broken and the apartment was ransacked.
What was taken?
They took my camera, my stereo, my paperwork. I lost irreplaceable personal items.
Were you scared?
No, I was angry. And I felt helpless because I knew I could never find out what really happened. And I knew I'd never get my stuff back. It's like a feeling of violation when you know that someone has broken into your private space and taken your things. I called the police so that I could have a record of what was stolen for tax purposes, but they never caught the thief.
And that wasn't the first time you were robbed?
No, I've had things taken by pickpockets. Once someone took my wallet on the subway, and there was a letter from my girlfriend in it that I like to carry around with me. Not really important, I suppose, but it had sentimental value, and when something like that happens, you lose a part of your past. That time, I felt angry at myself, because they always tell you not to put your wallet in your back pocket.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 138. Excerpt 1.
I'd like to ask both of you, now that you have a young child, whether you worry about the level of crime in the city.
Well, personally, it doesn't affect me that much, but I hear so many stories and I see it on the TV news, so I'm aware of it and concerned about it.
Excerpt 2.
Do you worry that violence could affect your life? Well, I've never seen anyone with a gun, and much less seen a shooting, but just last week someone got shot in a bookstore in the safest part of the city.
Excerpt 3.
So then what happened?
Well, I gave them the money and I just went home. But I felt so bad. You know, I really had mixed feelings about it. I wanted to say, guys, what are you doing? You know, go home. You're ruining your lives.
Excerpt 4.
Were you scared?
No, I was angry, and I felt helpless because I knew I could never find out what really happened, and I knew I'd never get my stuff back.
Lecture. Michael Anglin. Crime and Ways of Solving Crime. Before the lecture. Clarifying your notes. Page 143.
Crime can be divided into two main categories, misdemeanors and felonies. A misdemeanor is broadly defined as a crime that is punishable with more than 15 days in prison, but less than 1 year. A felony carries a term of imprisonment for more than 1 year. When a person who commits a misdemeanor or a felony is caught, that person, who is called a defendant or the accused, goes through a legal process that ends with a judge or jury finding him either guilty or innocent. If the person is found guilty, then a judge decides what the punishment should be.
Lecture. Part 1. Types of Crime. Clarifying your notes. Page 145.
Crime can be divided into two main categories, misdemeanors and felonies. A misdemeanor is broadly defined as a crime that is punishable with more than 15 days in prison, but less than 1 year. A felony carries a term of imprisonment for more than 1 year. When a person who commits a misdemeanor or a felony is caught, that person, who is called a defendant or the accused, goes through a legal process that ends with a judge or jury finding him either guilty or innocent. If the person is found guilty, then a judge decides what the punishment should be. Let me begin by talking about types of felonies. Some of the more serious felonies include burglary, robbery, arson, kidnapping, rape, and murder. These crimes are so serious that anyone found guilty will spend some time in prison. A misdemeanor, on the other hand, could be pickpocketing, fare evasion, or something of that nature. But sometimes a crime that is a misdemeanor in one part of the country might be a felony in another part of the country. Another way in which people may classify crime is by using the terms white-collar crime or blue-collar crime. White-collar crime refers to crime committed by salaried employees in businesses and corporations. It includes tax fraud and embezzlement, and it can involve large sums of money and affect millions of people. One of the main types of white-collar crime is corporate crime. Corporate crime is committed by people of high social status who work in corporations. Corporate crime is very difficult to prosecute for two main reasons. First, because it's difficult to prove who's responsible. And second, because the criminals are usually wealthy and powerful. An example of corporate crime that was successfully prosecuted concerns the tobacco industry in the United States. The tobacco industry was found guilty of causing the deaths of thousands of people who smoke cigarettes. As punishment, tobacco companies have had to pay millions of dollars to the victims' families. The crimes you're more than likely to hear about are blue-collar crimes, such as burglary, car theft, pickpocketing, and so on. Perhaps we hear more about these because they happen more often. However, white-collar crime can have a greater impact on our society. Crime has always existed in society, but today there are new kinds of crimes. One example is the use of computers to steal identities. As more people have access to computers, the more likely it is for your identity to be stolen. If this happens, criminals may open several credit card and bank accounts in your name. And of course, they won't pay the bill. So that means your credit will be ruined, and that's very difficult to correct.
Lecture, Part 2, Ways of Solving Crime. Using your notes to answer test questions. Page 146.
As long as there has been crime, there have been ways to solve it. One of the oldest methods is interrogation, a method in which the police question people who might have committed the crime or might have information about the crime. Interrogation can help the police to establish many basic facts, but modern techniques for solving crime includes more complex and scientific methods. Let me first talk about a system often called crime hotlines. In some cases where law enforcement personnel have difficulty finding a criminal, they turn to private citizens for help in solving a crime. This system allows people to make a phone call or access to a website and give information to the police anonymously. This can often be effective when people are afraid to give information in public. Sometimes a family member may have committed the crime, and another family member finally decides to call the police and give information they have. Second, fingerprinting. Each person's fingerprint is unique. The ancient Chinese used fingerprints to sign legal papers. What better way to identify an individual? Yet, it was only in the late 19th century that fingerprints were first used to identify criminals. A variety of scientific techniques makes it possible for fingerprints to be lifted from most surfaces. Then they can be compared to the fingerprints the police have on file. A relatively new technique that crime fighters are now using is called psychological profiling. Criminal psychologists look at the crime and the way it was committed. Based on this information, they could try to understand the personality and motivation of the person who committed the crime. Then they can focus their search on people who match that profile. In some cases, private citizens are finding ways to solve crimes as well. With a little knowledge of electronics, anyone can put a hidden camera in a home or an office. In the 1990s, as an example, there were some cases where nannies were accused of abusing the children they were paid to care for. Hidden cameras were used to prove the nanny's guilt. However, the technique is controversial because it involves issues of privacy. Finally, let me discuss DNA. Of the most recent crime-solving techniques used, DNA is proving very effective. Each person, with the exception of identical siblings, has a unique DNA coding system. So, if criminals leave anything that can be tested at the scene of a crime, such as blood or hair, they can be identified. DNA was used to solve a crime for the first time in England in 1987. And since that time, it has become widely used and is considered 99% accurate. DNA testing can also be used to prove a person is innocent. Many prisoners have been released because DNA evidence proves they did not commit the crime of which they were convicted.
Unit 4, Breaking the Rules. Chapter 8, Controlling Crime. Getting started. Listening for opinions. Page 150. 1.
That's really terrible. What a horrible crime.
2.
I don't know. I guess the woman was wrong. After all, she was taking the son against the father's wishes.
3.
Well, that's a bad thing to do. At least nobody was hurt. But I think those kids should definitely be punished.
4.
Well, I don't know if that's so bad. Who knows? Maybe they had a good reason for refusing to pay the rent.
5.
That's awful. It's horrible how someone can trick an old person that way. Poor woman.
6.
That's not all that bad. I know a lot of teenagers who have done things like that.
Interview 1. Preventing juvenile crime. Listening for main ideas. Page 153.
Hi, David. I just saw a program on TV that said that juvenile crime was increasing, and I wanted to ask your opinion about how to how to prevent juvenile crime, because I know that you work with a lot of young people.
Well, first, I think the media exacerbates the problem. And the school system exacerbates the problem, too. Where I live, we have thousands of security guards in the schools and metal detectors, too. And the kids get searched as they go into school. Now, all of that presents the wrong message. The kids don't feel like they're going to school. They feel like they're going to jail. And so they're more likely to become violent. I think it's a cause and effect relationship. The students get violent because the system makes them like that.
So you're saying that the messages kids get from the media, and even from school, are responsible for making them do bad things?
Yes, I am. I think that every young person is essentially good. I mean, you see violent students who are violent in class, but put them on a one-to-one basis, and they're usually very friendly. It's not that they're really bad. It's that they're a product of their environment. If you give them a more caring environment, you really can change the kind of actions they take.
Well, what about all the social support systems?
You see, the problem is that social support systems have really fallen apart. Take, for example, Big Brother, Big Sister programs, or after-school programs. You know, and I don't mean just letting them stay in school until 6 o'clock, doing whatever they want. Kids should be doing healthy, supervised activities. A structured program of activities. Instructional programs, or it could be athletics. A lot of our schools used to have football teams, or basketball teams, or baseball teams. But the funding for programs like those has been cut. They've been eliminated, so that leaves a child with a lot of energy and nothing to do with it.
What do the Big Brother, Big Sister programs do?
Well, they have people a little older, say in their 20s, who are willing to spend time on an individual basis with a student in middle school or in high school. See, the problem is that a lot of kids don't get the one-on-one attention they need. But kids need to see that somebody really cares about them.
But what about kids who really do commit crimes? Stealing, pickpocketing, or drug abuse? Or something worse? I mean, you do get cases where kids become involved in really serious crimes. I mean, what should be done with kids like that?
Well, let me say that preventing crime is definitely better than punishing it. It's better to have good role models and stop crime before it starts. But we also need harsher punishments. You see some countries where drug crimes carry a maximum sentence of 20 years or life imprisonment. And the crime numbers go down very fast. Having stronger punishment does reduce crime. But you have to be sure that the punishments are fair. We're talking about juvenile crime. But white-collar crime needs to be punished too.
Interview 2. The Prison Experience. Listening for main ideas. Page 155.
Amy, because you're a lawyer, I wanted to get your opinion about crime control. And what I'd like to know is, what do you think really works? Not for hardened criminals, but for first-time offenders.
Well, you're asking me a pretty complex question. The first step, of course, is deterrence, to stop people from committing crime in the first place. That involves the economy. Are there enough jobs for everyone? There should be. And the social structure. Are there enough support systems? And so on.
And what about when people are convicted and put in prison?
Then the goal should be to have rehabilitation programs inside prisons, so that when the person comes out, they don't return to a life of crime. The problem is that recently, the kinds of programs that existed in the past, like education programs and drug treatment programs, have been cut. And so, convicted criminals are not being rehabilitated.
Can you explain a little more about these education programs and drug programs?
Yes. In some states, where the drug laws are very harsh, you end up having a lot of people in prisons who are not the kingpins of drug deals, but who are actually drug addicts. The point is that they need help. That's why there needs to be programs that have a psychological component and an educational component, because without these programs, people don't become rehabilitated. The prisoners have a lot of time on their hands, and a culture develops inside the prison. It takes on a life of its own, and gangs start. You see, gangs provide a family away from home, but we need to make prison a less repressive experience. Then we also need bridge programs.
Bridge programs?
Yes, for when they come out of prison. What is clear statistically is that most criminals are recidivists. That means they are repeat offenders. People go into prison, get out, and go right back in again. Bridge programs help with housing and jobs, so that society doesn't look at released prisoners in such a disdainful way, and so that no stigma is attached to them once they re-enter society. But unfortunately, there are only a very small number of these programs.
Listening for contrasting ideas. Page 155. Excerpt 1.
I think that every young person is essentially good. I mean, you see violent students who are violent in class, but put them on a one-to-one basis, and they're usually very friendly.
Excerpt 2.
What about kids who really do commit crimes?
Well, let me say that preventing crime is definitely better than punishing it.
Excerpt 3.
The goal should be to have rehabilitation programs inside prisons so that when the person comes out, they don't return to a life of crime.
Excerpt 4.
Can you explain a little more about these education programs and drug programs?
Yes. In some states, where the drug laws are very harsh, you end up having a lot of people in prisons who are not the kingpins of drug deals, but who are actually drug addicts. The point is that they need help.
Lecture. Jonathan Stack. The Death Penalty. Before the lecture. Recording numerical information. Page 160.
In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that capital punishment was unconstitutional. But the court reinstated it in 1976. Since then, over 1,000 executions have been carried out.
I read that according to recent statistics, 67% of Americans favor the death penalty in cases of murder. That's 2/3 of the population.
In the United States, there are about 9 murders a year per 100,000 people. In Japan, for example, that figure is 0.5. In France, it's 1.1.
Lecture. Part 1. Arguments against the death penalty. Using your notes to ask questions and make comments. Page 162.
There is probably no issue in criminal justice today more controversial than capital punishment, the death penalty. As you probably know, the United States is the only Western industrialized nation that allows capital punishment. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that capital punishment was unconstitutional. But the court reinstated it in 1976. Since then, over 1,000 executions have been carried out. Executions are usually carried out by lethal injection or electrocution. Today, I'd like to talk to you about some of the main arguments against this form of punishment. Of course, the first question most people ask is, does capital punishment deter crime? Well, although there are studies that have linked the increase in executions with a decrease in homicides, a great many social scientists argue that there is no such link. In fact, states with the most executions are also the states with the highest homicide rates. So I do not believe that it is an effective deterrence. The death penalty does not deter murder. My second point is that capital punishment is not used fairly. Nearly all prisoners who are sentenced to death are poor males. And some states, like Louisiana and Mississippi, still use the death penalty, whereas other states, like Iowa, do not. Race is also a factor. Historically, African Americans have been more likely to be executed than whites, both in proportion to the general population and to the prison population. I have another major objection to capital punishment, which is that because we are human, there is always the possibility that we can make mistakes. We always have to question if we have gotten the facts right. According to the Death Penalty Information Center in Washington, at least 138 prisoners were released from death row in 26 states because they were improperly convicted or because evidence of their innocence was discovered after they were sentenced to death. In the state of Illinois, a few years ago, there were 26 people on death row, and 13 of them were released because new evidence proved that they were innocent. These are 13 people who would have been executed by the state. So in other words, we do make mistakes, and we have to allow for the possibility of that error. Once you execute somebody, you've done something that should not be in the domain of the state. It's almost as if you're playing the role of God on life or death issues. I believe that killing someone is a moral decision, and that it is not a decision the state should make.
Lecture, Part 2. Questions, Answers, and Comments. Using your notes to ask questions and make comments. Page 163.
Now I'll take some questions.
Yes, I have a question. Isn't it true that the public supports the death penalty? I read that according to recent statistics, 67% of Americans favor the death penalty in cases of murder. That's 2/3 of the population.
It's true that there is support for the death penalty, but it is also true that people's moods and opinions are difficult to understand through statistics. I think this figure might reflect people's concern about violent crime in general. The United States is by far the most violent industrialized nation. In the United States, there are about 9 murders a year per 100,000 people. In Japan, for example, that figure is 0.5. In France, it's 1.1. So, Americans are understandably concerned about violence.
Excuse me, Mr. Stack. What did you say the figure was in the United States?
It's about 9 murders per year per 100,000 people.
I'd like to make a comment. I mean, if someone commits a really bad crime, don't they deserve to be punished just as severely?
The problem with the death penalty is that on an emotional level, you can understand why people want it. If you've suffered the loss of a loved one, your immediate response is to want revenge. It's a normal, natural reaction. But I feel that the reason we have laws is that they allow us to rise above our personal, emotional response to crime. This form of retribution is not the answer. The idea of having laws in a society is that together, as a society, we are stronger than the sum of our parts. We can rise above our personal, emotional response to crime. The legal system is supposed to make us better. It is set up so that it is better than us. Individually, we are flawed, but as a society, we are strong, and more states are eliminating the death penalty.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the death penalty not being fair because it was applied to some people but not to others. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. In many ways, capital punishment is very arbitrary. If you really believed in the death penalty as a principle, as a punishment for a horrific crime, then every single person who has committed this crime would have to be executed. But that would mean that we would have about 50,000 executions a year. That's absurd. Nobody would stand for that. It would mean that the state was some kind of killing machine. The fact is that we do execute some people, but other people who have committed similar crimes are not executed. So the death penalty is not applied equally to all people.
Mr. Stack, I'd like to thank you for your comments today. I'm opposed to death penalty myself, and I don't think we talk enough about these issues.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.